Swarnam Wagle wears so many hats, I probably don't have time to explain them all, but one I just learned is that he's an alum of ANU. So welcome back. He's also had a very distinguished career that includes being a member of parliament a few times, I think, in Nepal, working with the UN. He really builds a wealth of experience in public finance and economic policy, and he's served in several roles shaping Nepal's development priorities and regional cooperation.
Thank you, Anthea. Pleasure to join you in this August panel, and thank you for showing up this early. Taking the long view, I think now we have reasonable body of evidence. We've tracked the transformations of so many countries on the continent, and we can fairly conclude that no country in Asia has transformed durably on a sustainable basis over at least a generation. So that's about 25 years just on the basis of aid, right? So much of that transformation has been internally led. And if you resort to the findings of, let's say, the Spence report that tracked the growth performance of many of these countries, 9 of the 13 miracle economies in the aftermath of the Second World War have been from Asia. And it's all, visionary leadership leading our developmental state, mobilizations of savings and investment, a healthy reliance on the markets for resource allocation, macroeconomic stability, and the reliance on the world markets, ideas, and capital, right? So where aid has come in many of these success stories is as a catalytic, you use that word, catalytic input to unlock growth potentials in areas where those respective countries have had a relative advantage. So it's to unlock those potentials. Absolute amount of aid, accumulated over time, over decades, often does not explain the success story, right? So that's the big myth. We need to look into it. And so you can track, when it comes to catalytic intervention, compare Marshall aid, 13 billion in those days. In today's dollars, it would be around $150 billion. And contrast that with the amount of aid inflows into countries like Lebanon or even Afghanistan. And there you sort of, I think it makes the point more vividly that it's not these absolute inflows of aid, but what you do with it and whether it positions you to unlock those potentials over a longer period of time. So I think this is important to reinforce at a time when the absolute numbers of the aid volumes are shrinking, coming down. So it's not what comes in, but which sectors they go into and what they do that matter. And I think this is sort of the longer term insight on what aid does. I think on this discussion on philanthropy, it's good to marry that with the emerging literature on state capacity, right? So if you draw on the works of Karthik Muralidharan and others in the context of India largely, but it applies to Nepal, Bangladesh, and the South Asian context overall. Even these governments or states in poor countries that we love to malign and criticize, they do certain things very well, right? They do elections exceptionally well. They do vaccination drives exceptionally well. They handle disasters pretty well, the early response. They may falter as time goes on, but the immediate response, they've got a good hang of it. But they do day-to-day governance horribly and really badly, right? And the essential provisioning of services really poorly. So what's the difference? Well, with the earlier lot, you have a clear goal, you have a deadline, and you can measure success. You know what success looks like, right? So this idea of state delivery on a mission mode is really worth distinguishing from the day-to-day governing that my governments are really corrupt at the way they handle these things. They're really inept, and so this distinction is important. So where philanthropy and these new emerging models can come in is really not to substitute the state, that can never be done, not to replicate the state, but carve out those components of what is legitimately a state function, but that should be run on a mission mode. Clear goals, deadlines, and know what success, how success is defined. So then, that analytical clarity would then lead you to areas like, maybe midday meals when it comes to nutrition, maybe school curricula, supplementary training of teachers in science, maths, and English, for example, right? This is again a very relevant. We have an amazing shortage of qualified teachers that are deployed in the rural areas, and infrastructure bottlenecks. Point that leads to my earlier argument about unlocking growth potentials. Can they be used to build capacity to crowd in private capital? Could be drafting insolvency laws, could be designing and implementing world-class procurement contracts, and staffing and strengthening the capacities of investment boards, for example. So that little help, a $10 million grant that will eventually over 10 years will attract $1 billion in private capital. So those are the areas. So both the mission mode functions of a legitimate state and these areas where with a little input you can draw in a lot of additional resources. So that's what I would be looking at in the context of Nepal. On themes like you mentioned, global public goods and ring fencing, we are the custodians of the Central Himalayas. So we take climate very seriously. 10 rivers that flow from the Himalayas, sustain the livelihoods of around 2 billion people in Asia. And here Nepal is really punching above its weight when it comes to bearing the brunt of climate impacts, but also contributing to the global ecological services. We almost 50% of our territory is now forested, so we're providing to the globe much more than what negative impacts we might be making. So on those issues, we would like to be rewarded, right, by the international community, and on the SDGs, sort of the ring fencing is really on issues of the last mile challenges in electricity access, in water and sanitation, etc. But also those remaining pockets of acute deprivation in poverty, hunger, those need to be really protected and addressed. Because when you take a general picture, Nepal is the second poorest country in the Asia Pacific after Afghanistan. Yet our extreme levels of poverty have plummeted from about 55% to under 1%. I don't think this has been noted too much, but you use a sort of a low bar, $2.15 benchmark. If you use the higher benchmark of $6.85, the poverty levels are still high. But that, with the more extreme bar, the level, the plummeting happened not because of aid or not because of private inflows, but because of remittances over the last 30 years. So that's another sort of topic that we need to look at. Why did it work so dramatically? As an economist, I start with numbers, right? So when you look at the overall aid figures in recent years, the OECD DAC figure is around $150 billion per annum, cross-border flow. Much bigger than that is FDI, about 4 times larger, $500 billion, and it's been coming down to developing countries. Multiply that by 1.5, then you come into remittances again, $750 billion just flowing into developing countries. And so ODA on this spectrum of cross-border flows is the least significant. Now contrast that with what you have within your borders, right? The global GDP is $110 trillion. If you assume a tax to GDP ratio of around 20%, so we're talking about $110 trillion globally, but in developing countries, just to make it comparable, it's around $45 to $50 trillion, and 20% of that would be around $10 trillion. So for me, a lot of the sort of focus should be on that resource. So treating investment, treating aid as that input to improve domestic tax capacity, right? So that there's so much leakage and we don't raise enough of what exists within our borders. And it's a much, much, much larger pie. And if you use that resource well, and rather than spreading this across sectors, across agencies, across multiple functions, can you pool those resources to do one or two things really well, right? So when it comes to big transformational things over the last 20-30 years, well, China's much vaunted figure of having pulled 800 million people out of poverty, it's largely their export orientation, the surplus that they then redirected into public investments and targeted anti-poverty schemes. The vast array of social programs that Prime Minister Modi has unleashed in India now, medical insurance for 500 million people, rural guarantee schemes, Atal Innovation Labs, etc. All that is sort of big transformative ideas. Microfinance in an earlier era in a country like Bangladesh, right? And what remittances did for Nepal, and can you find a parallel initiative? So the analog there is, can you stream small flows of money directly into the households. And this is where the conditional cash transfers, etc., social programs of that nature. So for me, those are the big, bold ideas that really worked, right? That pulled not 100 families out of poverty, but tens of millions of people out of poverty over a longer span. So, as a politician now, a former economist, I would want to look into those, draw lessons from those big, bold interventions that are proven to have worked in these diverse settings. Yeah, I was engaging with the Nepali diaspora. I've been, in Sydney, and last night in Canberra, and tomorrow in Perth, and this question comes up very frequently, right? So you say the government needs to do this and that, but how can we count on the current crop of crooks to lead all this? And we actually were counting. So there've been 30 governments or 30 prime ministers in the last 35 years in Nepal after the change of regime. Of those 30 different regime changes or government changes, I think three had an historic opportunity to do something big, bold, transformative, right? In the sense that they came through a long period of struggle, imprisoned for 8 to 10 years for political beliefs. These were mini Nelson Mandelas, when they started, right? And they ended up becoming Robert Mugabe's at the end. But they did have a chance, that rare opening with 2/3 majority, a relatively stable environment, where the citizenry also really, supported them, right? So that's a precondition. You need a clean, visionary, committed leadership to lead a relatively functional developmental state to pull off these things. But as I just outlined, there have been openings, and hopefully there will be more in the years to come. And one has to fight for it. So there's an election after that Gen Z rupture that we saw in September. We're having elections in about 3 months now, and hopefully, with the young demography, the intense pressure that the growing diaspora is now putting in place, hopefully we'll finally have that departure in our politics. I am one of the candidates for Member of Parliament again. And, if we get our party that is young, reform-oriented, a lot of returnees from abroad who bring back tons of experience, if we get a majority, maybe we'll be able to implement many of the bold ideas that we're talking about. I just also want to add to the previous question on sovereign guarantees, insurance, maybe not directly, but how important it is to address this issue as we talk about the larger reform of the financial architecture, right? So again, countries like Nepal, very poor, corrupt, weak state capacity, we can't attract private capital. We don't even have access to private capital markets, right? So this is where the IDA component of the World Bank funding, the more concessional loans that come from Asian Development Bank, those are the only really significant sources that fund the vital infrastructural bottlenecks. And so as we wait to graduate, to be credible enough to borrow in international financial markets, the role of institutions like MIGA, for example, right, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, even the role of IFC to come in and invest, let's say take a 20% stake in a particular venture, so that it sends a signal to other investors that, well, this is being backed by a credible international agency, so it's safe enough for you to come in and invest. So these roles of multilateral agencies should not be forgotten as we talk about reform and changing the whole appearance of the current architecture. And we've been also very innovative schemes that I've been looking at in the context of Nepal, very vulnerable to climate disasters, which will intensify in the years ahead. The scheme of catastrophic insurance schemes that they have tried in the Caribbean, for example, or in the Caucasus, again, led by agencies like the World Bank, where you don't have to face a disaster and then panic. If you have insurance schemes in place, sovereign insurance schemes in place, you can even dull disasters. The disasters can be dulled. It do not lead to upheavals. And this is, I'm borrowing the terminology of Stefan Durkan, the previous chief economist of DFID. So this is very, very important for weak and vulnerable countries. And finally, the big example on this is also the fact that vaccines, we saw this during COVID, the rich pharma companies never invested in tropical diseases or diseases of relevance to poor countries because we couldn't be able to, compensate for the heavy R&D that it entails. So again, engineered by development agencies, you had that big vaccine prize, invent a vaccine that can cure these diseases that you've been neglecting and will reward you, right? So this is an area of missing markets, where agencies can creatively come in. And so the role of insurance, role of sovereign guarantees is vital as countries like mine wait to become richer. Just pulling together the different strands of thoughts that we shared today. And there's immense needs. The resources are scarce, so we really need to do a better job at the science of delivery. A much used phrase, but we haven't. And here, so the different new sources coming in, complementing, not replicating the state, but really working, carving out those niche on mission mode, so that we can deliver better. Pool resources. Don't spread resources thin across agencies, across sectors, across different forms. Is it concessional loan? Is it grants? Is it TA? Is it experts parachuting in? Is it domestic NGOs? So try and narrow down those things to focus on the big prize relevant to your country at that particular time. So for the dirt poor, really low income countries, maybe it's the last mile challenges in nutrition or education. For the sort of middle income countries, maybe it's that infrastructure challenges. So identify, which might be relevant for the 3 to 5 year period, that one or two big areas where you really need to focus. When you spread thin, it's really not delivered.